Hey, excuse me. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Imaginary Lines. I am one of your hosts. My name is Keith Giles, and I'm an author and podcaster and a guy who likes to talk about art and poetry and music and literature and film and all kinds of cool stuff with my friend Darrell Epp, who is a really great writer and a poet, and who also is really a wealth of knowledge on many, many topics like that. And so in this episode, what is it? This is episode six? Episode six, I think. I'm losing
Could
track.
be.
I have to start keeping track of these things. Yeah, so I think we had talked about maybe in this episode, we wanted to start off. You had something you wanted to read to us, right? It's like a short story or something.
Yeah, I sure did. In the last episode, we talked about Christian art, uh, art history, what makes good art, the meaning of life, and all that. And we'll be coming back to that in a future episode.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm really an evangelist for is John Cheever. It's kind of a sad story where he's a guy who was really ill-served by his critics, where the conventional wisdom for him is totally out to lunch. And if people still remember him at all, because he wore like penny loafers and a sweater vest, they think he was a square and they call him the poet laureate of the suburbs and all this stuff. And it's total nonsense. And he actually wrote these cracked out fairy tales that if he was from a foreign land, critics would have put him on the shelf next to Borges and Italo Calvino. But because he wrote about Long Island,
Yeah.
And Providence never loved in his own hometown, all that stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They just didn't see it. But he was a master, and he had a long career. And he wrote stories for the New Yorker for half a century. And it's a real tribute to the power of hard work, because if you read, there's a book that's his collected short stories, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it has an orange cover. And everybody has to have that book. And the stories keep on getting better and better till the end, right? And one of his first stories was called The Enormous Radio. And in the middle of the 20th century, it was actually anthologized a lot in science fiction anthologies at the drugstore, because basically there's a tenement where everyone has a radio, and when they turn the dial, they can hear conversations from other apartments.
Interesting.
And like I said, some adventurous sci-fi editor put it in the sci-fi anthology, right? And that's kind of like what we said before about how J.G. Ballard said it's hard not to write science fiction,
Right.
in the sense that if you look around, you're like, that's weird. Why aren't we talking about how effing weird this all is?
Right.
Right. So his stories, so you read his collected works, his first stories, you're like, man, that's great. And they just get better and better, where he'll have stories that are more experimental, more plotless, more daring, and he kept on challenging himself till the end. So anyhow, here's a story. We're going to read it and then talk about it. And it's a short story. It's called Reunion. Okay. The last time I saw my father was in Grand Central Station. I was going from my grandmother's in the Adirondacks to a cottage on the Cape that my mother had rented. And I wrote my father that I would be in New York between trains for an hour and a half, and asked if we could have lunch together. His secretary wrote to say that he would meet me at the information booth at noon, and at 12 o'clock sharp, I saw him coming through the crowd. He was a stranger to me. My mother divorced him 3 years ago, and I hadn't been with him since. But as soon as I saw him, I felt, oh man, this is even going to make me cry. But as soon as I saw him, I felt that he was my father, my flesh and blood, my future and my doom. I knew that when I was grown, man,
Yeah.
see, it's funny, I cry at weird things. I knew that when I was grown, I would be something like him. I would have to plan my campaigns within his limitations. He was a big, good-looking man, and I was terribly happy to see him again. He struck me on the back and shook my hand. "Hi, Charlie," he said. "Hi, boy. I'd like to take you up to my club, but it's in the 60s, and if you have to catch an early train, I guess we'd better get something to eat around here." He put his arm around me, and I smelled my father the way my mother sniffs a woolens, and the rank, wait, pardon me. He put his arm around me, and I smelled my father the way my mother sniffs a rose. It was a rich compound of whiskey, aftershave lotion, shoe polish, woolens, and the rankness of a mature male. I hoped that someone would see us together.
Yeah.
I wished that we could be photographed. I wanted some record of our having been together. We went out on the station and up a side street to a restaurant. It was still early, and the place was empty. The bartender was quarreling with a delivery boy, and there was one very old waiter in a red coat by the kitchen door. We sat down, and my father hailed the waiter in a loud voice. "Kellner," he shouted, "Garçon, cameriere," which is French for waiter. "You." His boisterous in the empty restaurant seemed out of place. "Could we have a little service here?" he shouted. "Chop, chop." Then he clapped his hand. This caught the waiter's attention, and he shuffled over to our table. Were you clapping your hands at me?" he asked. Calm down, sommelier," my father said. "If it isn't too much to ask of you, if it wouldn't be too much above and beyond the call of duty, we would like a couple of Beefeater Gibsons." "I don't like to be clapped at," the waiter said. "I should have brought my whistle," my father said. "I have a whistle that is audible only to the ears of old waiters. Now, take out your little pad and your little pencil and see if you can get this straight. 2 Beefeater Gibsons. Repeat after me. 2 Beefeater Gibsons." "I think you'd better go somewhere else," the waiter said quietly. "That," said my father, "is one of the most brilliant suggestions I've ever heard. Come on, Charlie, let's get the hell out of here." I followed my father out of that restaurant into another. He was not so boisterous this time. Our drinks came, and he cross-questioned me about the baseball season. He then struck the edge of his empty glass with his knife and began shouting again. "Garçon, Kellner, cameriere, you! Could we trouble you to bring us 2 more of the same?" "How old is the boy?" the waiter asked. "That," my father said, "is none of your goddamn business." "I'm sorry, sir," the waiter said, "but I won't serve the boy another drink." "Well, I have some news for you," my father said. "I have some very interesting news for you. This doesn't happen to be the only restaurant in New York. They've opened another one on the corner. Come on, Charlie." He paid the bill, and I followed him out of that restaurant into another. Here, the waiters wore pink jackets like hunting coats, and there was a lot of horse tack on the walls. We sat down, and my father began to shout again. "Master of the hounds, tally-ho, and all that sort of thing. We'd like a little something in the way of a stirrup cup, namely 2 Bibson Geefeaters." "2 Bibson Geefeaters?" the waiter asked, smiling. "You know damn well what I want," my father said angrily. "I want 2 Beefeater Gibsons, and make it snappy. Things have changed in jolly old England, so my friend the Duke tells me. Let's see what England can produce in the way of a cocktail." "This isn't England," the waiter said. "Don't argue with me," my father said. "Just do as you're told." "I just thought you might like to know where you are," the waiter said. If there is one thing I cannot tolerate, my father said, it is an impudent domestic. Come on, Charlie. The fourth place we went to was Italian. Buongiorno, my father said. Per favore, possiamo avere du cocktail americani. Forty, molto gin, poco vermouth. I don't understand Italian, the waiter said. Oh, come off it, my father said. You understand Italian, and you know damn well you do. Vogliamo du cocktail americani, subito. The waiter left us and spoke with the captain, who came over to our table and said, I'm sorry, sir, but this table is reserved. All right, my father said, get us another table. All the tables are reserved, the captain said. I get it, my father said. You don't desire our patronage. Is that it? Well, the hell with you. Vada al inferno. Let's go, Charlie. I have to get my train, I said. I'm sorry, Sonny, my father said. I'm terribly sorry. He put his arm around me and pressed me against him. I'll walk you back to the station. If there had only been time to go up to my club. That's all right, Daddy. I'll get you a paper, he said. I'll get you a paper to read on the train. Then he went up to a newsstand and said, Kind sir, will you be good enough to favor me with one of your goddamn no good 10-cent afternoon papers? The clerk turned away from him and stared at a magazine cover. Is it asking too much for you to sell me one of your disgusting specimens of yellow journalism? I have to go, Daddy, I said. It's late. Now just wait a second, Sonny, he said. Just wait a second. I want to get a rise out of this chap. Goodbye, Daddy, I said. And I went down the stairs and got my train. And that was the last time I saw my father.
Wow. That is so good. Wow. Wow. And I don't know if you know about this or not. I don't think we've talked about this. But 2 days ago, I spoke at my father's memorial service. He died almost exactly a year ago, August 31st, so in a couple of days. Tomorrow, as we're recording this, it's tomorrow. As you're listening to this, it's probably a week ago. But yeah, so this particular story that you decided to read is very, very timely for me, remembering my dad. And what a beautiful story. I can't help but laugh. I don't know if I'm supposed to laugh, but I found it a lot of it was
Go
very
ahead.
funny.
Go ahead. It's a free country.
Right. I guess I love, just like capturing what a character the father is. And you really, really get a sense of the father, just being this character. And honestly, it reminds me of my dad a lot. My dad was not that rude, but he could definitely be a character and do those kinds of things and make you laugh and embarrass you and all that stuff. That was just so great. That's a wonderful choice.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I said in a previous episode, whenever someone says they have writer's block,
Yeah.
write about dad, because everyone has a dad, and everyone has, an endlessly profound relationship with dad, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
And, like you always will, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah. And what if I told you that for decades after Cheever wrote that story, he wrote stories that were way better?
Yeah. I need to read more of Cheever. To be honest, I don't think I've read his stuff.
Okay.
I'm gonna go check him out.
Yeah, I as far as American writing ever, I put him very near the top.
Yeah.
So basically, you know how in a previous episode, we put forward the bold claim that Jesus was good at telling stories, right?
Right.
And one thing about Jesus' stories, when you go back to them, it surprises you to notice how little is there. Like, oh, wow, this famous story that's haunted the world for 20 centuries, it's like 10 words or something.
Right.
Right? Because what people don't get is good storytelling is about what I call gapping.
Yeah.
Where you write down everything you know about the story, and then you get out your liquid paper and take out all these bits.
Yeah.
And leave it for the reader, right? So you know how Jesus leaves you asking questions, like in the prodigal son story, you read the story and say, well, what happened next? What did the older brother say?
Right.
Right. And that's why it's a good story.
Yeah. Because you don't know.
Because the father says, how about you drop your resentment and party?
Yeah.
And the story ends. So then the human race is like, well, what did he say? What did he say? And that's why the story haunts, right? Things like that, right?
Yeah.
And John Cheever is also a master of gapping. Him and Chekov, both about the way they dole out information in this way that's excruciating, but also really pleasing.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, here we're left with a question, right? This story asks us a few questions. First off, the dad, he's a member of a club, and they don't go to his club.
Right.
And why don't they go to his club?
It's supposed to be too far away, right?
Right. And where is the club? Okay. The club is in the 60s. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Now, where is Grand Central Station? It's on 42nd Street.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, the dad is saying, we don't have time to walk 20 blocks, but we do have time to get kicked out of 4 different restaurants.
Right. And actually not actually really ever get anything.
Right. So it's kind of sad, but maybe there's another reason why I can't go to that club.
Right. That's an excuse. And maybe there isn't a club or he's embarrassed about what the club is like
or because of his douchebag behavior, he's not allowed at the club anymore.
Right.
So, that's one thing you notice. And again, because we have to piece that together, that's why it's literature and not just, a diary entry or an inert dead thing,
Yeah.
So another question is what happened next, right? At the end of the story, it says, that was the last time I saw my father, right? So the question is, why didn't he see his father again, right? Okay. Is it possible that 5 seconds later, the father slipped on a banana peel and broke his neck and died, right? Is that why he didn't see his father again?
We don't know. Maybe.
Well, actually, yeah. But actually, because at the end of the story, the dad says wait, and the son doesn't wait.
Yeah.
That and then says goodbye, Dad. That actually is a tell where that's Cheever's code way of telling us the reason he didn't see his dad again was because he chose to be active instead of passive and cut his dad out of his life.
Right.
Okay?
Yes. Yeah.
And he doesn't say that, but because the dad says, like, who's a hard-charging alpha male, and he says, wait a second, and the son doesn't wait a second, that's how you know.
Yeah.
So basically, the son says, man, I don't want to be like this guy. I'm never going to see him again. I'm going to be the captain of my own ship and change my life and change my destiny, right?
Yeah.
So he chose never to see his dad again. Okay. Now, which leads to another question. Did it work? Okay. Was the son able to escape and get out from under the shadow of his dad? And spoiler alert, if he did, that would be the first time in human history that ever happened.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I think there's a bit of a clue even at the beginning, because I'm scrolling back. I have it up on the screen here. I'm scrolling back up to the top. And then there are some clues, I think, peppered throughout even the beginning of the story. Because, he's telling it in a flashback. He's remembering, let me tell you about this time, the last time I saw my dad. And as he's setting it up, there's a little bit in there of, I think he even talks about this, right? I love the fact I wrote down one of my favorite lines about my future and my doom.
Yeah.
Yeah. And here then the line after that, I knew that when I was grown, I would be something like him. I would have to plan my campaigns within his limitations. So, that tells you right at the beginning, he's telling you, by the way, I could never escape his shadow. And I couldn't, either like I wanted to, I didn't want to be this way, but unfortunately, like, no, that's not possible. But in a way, it's not even unfortunate. It's sort of like, there's that youthful desire to, like you said, be your own person. I'm not going to be like my dad. It's ironic because my dad said that about his father. Anytime anybody ever pointed out that my dad looked like his father, he would get really upset because he didn't like that. But it was obvious to everybody, you look just like your dad. But to him, the implication wasn't just that he looked like his dad. I think what offended him was that he was like his dad, and he didn't ever want to be. And what he meant by that was the negative stuff, right? The stuff that the ways his father hurt him, or the things that caused the rift between them. And so he had determined as a young man, I will not be like my father, meaning I won't repeat these mistakes. I won't do these things to my son. And so there was always that desire. And yet, again, it's this impossible thing. One way or the other, you will be like, there are things you can't escape. And sometimes that's for better or worse. Sometimes you pick up the good stuff too. And that's good. And recognizing there's good and bad in everybody.
Yeah. Accepting that there's no escape is part of the thing about, life and getting through it successfully, right?
Yeah.
And just choosing to hang on to the good stuff, I guess, right?
Yeah.
What's funny, what you said there about your dad, reminds me of Anton Chekov, surprisingly, because it turns out everything reminds me of Anton Chekov. So there's a famous bit in a Chekov play where there's a doctor at his country house, and he's talking to the maid, and he says, "What do you think of my mustache? Do you like my mustache?" And for a century, actors are like, "Well, how do I play that? Is he clowning? Is he taunting? Is he just saying something because he's bored?"
Yeah.
And actually, what that's really about, like all of Chekhov, like it's a cliche to say Chekhov isn't about plot, but he's not even about character. He's about the sense of inevitably feeling yourself drifting forward on the river of time and not being able to, and going, oh man, I'd like to rewind and go back and redo that kind of, but oh, there it goes, right?
Yeah.
And what that mustache bit with the doctor in that play is actually about is the moment when that fateful day when a man looks in the mirror and says, good Lord, what happened?
Right.
I turned into my dad.
Yeah.
I thought I would define myself in opposition to him, right?
Yeah.
But now I just looked in the mirror and I've turned into him. And I got hair growing in funny places, like what happened, right?
Yeah.
So it's about that shock, right? And so that thing with the mustache is a big thing for me in my writing. And another thing that's a big deal for me is the songwriter Iggy Pop. He said one time he had this idea, like he's a song called "The Passenger," and he said he had this idea about talking about life through the metaphor of a journey by car in the passenger seat.
Mm-hmm.
Where imagine that you're in the passenger seat, and like, wow, look at all those telephone poles whizzing by. There they go, bang, bang, bang. Oh, there's something. There it's gone.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're not in control of it. You can't. You're the passenger. You can't go, hey, let me stop and turn around, or let me slow down and look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, what's funny in Cheever is there's actually a bit of symbolism going on here where it's kind of funny. Like this this story is really short. And when you read it, it's like, wow, I can't believe it's that awesome and so short, right? And symbolism is a funny thing where it seems like writers I like have obsessive imagery that they go back to, and symbolism is a bit more sneaky than students or amateurs think it is. But it's funny how in this story, a lot of the heavy lifting, and the reason it can say so much and have such a small word count, is the fact it takes place at Grand Central Station.
Yeah.
Right? Because the story takes place at Grand Central Station, there's a lot I don't have to tell you, right?
Right.
And the train station is a symbol. Because what happens at Grand Central Station? Journeys begin and journeys end.
Yeah.
And it's a place full of people waiting for something to happen.
Yeah, that's good.
So it's like you know how the cartoonist Frank Miller, he moved from New York City to LA. So he started setting his stories so when he was cartooning in New York, he said as soon as he put those like water tank reservoir things on top of buildings, for him that's New York, right? And then when he went to Hollywood and started writing stories about Hollywood, he said, all I have to do, because comics is about shorthand, and it's a real abbreviated language. He said, all I had to do was start putting convertibles and palm trees.
I was going to say palm trees, and convertibles.
That's it. Okay. So he does Sin City, and all you have to do to let people know where he's moved from Manhattan to LA is convertibles and palm trees.
Yeah.
That's it, right?
Yeah, that's great.
So so again, it's like this isn't what people think of when they study symbolism in school. But if you've been around the block a few times and you say Grand Central Station, I've got to catch a train, Dad. Sorry about your luck, right?
Yeah.
It's like you don't have to beat me over the head with it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, there's so much good stuff in that too. I think I mean, I don't want to take us too far off of this discussion, but when you were talking about how Chekov and Cheever are both masters of the way they dole out information, and about how great writing is about, this gapping, how things are actually, how you can, if you're a really good writer, I think to me, I agree with you. I think the mark of a really good writer and of a good piece of writing is the ability to sort of compress that information in a way. So I remember when I took I was a creative writing major in college. And so I took a fiction writing class. And a guy named Ken Anderson, he's a good writer. He has a book called Sympathy for the Devil, and he has another one called Night Dogs. They're both excellent books. And but I'll never forget this series of assignments he gave the class. So first he had us all write a hard-boiled detective story. And he said, I want it to be 4 pages and, write your scene. Just basically write a scene from a hard-boiled detective story. So we all did that, came back the next day. We all read our stories to each other. We kind of workshopped the stories. People made suggestions, which I love, by the way. Workshopping is awesome. People are brutal and you need that. And so we'd workshop the stories for that week. And then the next week he said, all right, your next week's assignment is this. I'm going to take the story, the 4-page story. I want you to have the exact same thing happen. All the same information, all the same dialogue, all the same action has to happen, but I want you to make it 2 pages. So you have to eliminate 2 pages worth of stuff, but without, shortening the scene or changing the dialogue or changing what happens. And of course, we're all thinking, this is insane. You can't do that. How am I supposed to do that? But you know what? When we sat down to do it, I was like, well, I didn't need this line. And this is superfluous, and I don't need to mention this. And well, why do I have to build up to this? I could just jump straight into this, right?
Yeah.
So I did. I eliminated it, got it down to 2 pages. We all come back, we read our stories to each other, and we're all like, man, this is way better. And he goes, okay, you guys did a good job. Now the assignment for next week is take your 2-page story, which used to be a 4-page story, do the exact same thing, but cut it down to 1 page. And now I thought this guy had lost his mind. I'm like, okay, look, man, come on. The 2 pages from 4 pages was hard enough, but you're right, it improved it was good. But now you're asking me to take a 4-page story and turn it into a 1-page story or scene. Like, that's impossible, man. But again, went back, sat down with it, cut it down to one page, and damn if that is not the best scene I have ever written in my life. And that process, putting us through that process of eliminating the superfluous information, the details that you don't need, you boil it down to only what is essential to communicate the emotion and the feeling and the action and the tone and the mood and the place, the atmosphere of what's happening. That's how you write a story, man. That I learned so much from that process. And I think this goes back to something you and I had said before. I think we touched on this in a previous episode about how, like, I talk to writers a lot. I have this little thing called Authors Academy where I try to help, authors and work on their writing and all that stuff. And so I tell people a lot when they talk about writing especially writing their first book. It doesn't matter if it's fiction or nonfiction. I tell them, I promise you, if you've ever read a great book, you are not reading the first draft of that book. You're reading the probably third, fourth, fifth, sixth draft of that book, because it's great writing isn't just about, nothing comes out of the blue and it's perfect, on the page, ding, there it is. You have to go back, you have to look at it again, examine, go through this process of kind of stuff I'm talking about. It's about rewriting and then rewriting again and editing and proofing and having someone else read it, give you honest feedback and cutting out your baby, like, man, I love that part, or I love that thing, but someone telling you that just doesn't work. It takes me out of the story. It's, you don't need it. And having the courage to say, you know what, you're right. I'm gonna have to cut that part out to make it, to serve the whole thing. So that's just an important thing. And you're right. I think when you notice it in people like Cheever or Chekov, I would even say, someone like John D. MacDonald or Raymond Chandler or hell, Mickey Spillane, like those guys know how to do that and they're really good at it.
Yeah, and certainly in the story Reunion, you do notice that nothing is there that doesn't matter.
Right.
And like, when you start writing, you think, oh, a guy walked in the room, I better describe his wardrobe from head to toe, right?
Right.
And then it's funny, when I look at the novels I like most that really move me, I don't know about if the guy has a bald spot or not, or like what color his shirt is, because it doesn't matter.
No.
Right?
No.
Yeah. So and the funny thing about that too is it gets back to what I was saying about how like don't write something if the reader can figure it out for himself and get a bigger bang that way.
Right.
For example, here I'll retell the story of Reunion, okay, but without any art, okay? Watch this. Dear Diary, good Lord, my dad is an effing douchebag. F that guy. I don't ever want to see him again. The end.
Right. There you go.
Okay. Okay. Now, that's not art because it doesn't leave you with any questions. It's inert. Someone reads that and says, okay, that's it, right?
Yeah, just the facts.
Yeah. So that's where the magic happens.
Right.
And also one thing that Cheever and Chekov have in common, Chekov had this idea that he wrote about in a letter to his cousin, where he said, if you want to really move a reader, when something dramatic happens, you don't milk the drama or say about how pathetic it was. When something really dramatic happens, the flatter you go, the bigger bang it will have. And that was really a big revolutionary thing at the time that people, had a hard time wrapping their head around. But it was really true, right? So you notice in this story, it's quite possible that when the son was sitting there in these 4 restaurants, he might have been sweating or red-faced and trembling with shame, right? But he doesn't say that.
Yeah, you're right.
It's like you read this. See, you read the story, and then maybe tomorrow you think back and go, oh man, if I'd been there, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, if you say this was the most dramatic, most moved, no, just don't,
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yeah. So in all those scenes, it's just the dad talking to the waiters, being kind of a jerk, getting kicked out. And yeah, you never, like, in other words, the Cheever never puts the character in that scene. Yeah, there's no reaction shot, right? You don't pan over and he's rolling his eyes, or he's like hiding, or or he's whispering an apology to the waiter as he walks away. I'm so sorry, you don't have any of that. And the fact, the absence of that really kind of does pull you as the reader, like the reader sort of going like, how would I react? Right? Because you're not telling me how the guy's reacting, but I know how I would react, right? It pulls you in.
But also it's kind of like if you're waiting and waiting for something like a punchline in a really well-performed joke or some other delayed gratification. That's kind of like part of the gag, where the payoff has more powerful way if you extend the anticipation. Yeah. So basically, maybe when this was going on, the narrator's heart was breaking, or his pulse was racing out of terror because he thought, am I going to turn out like this guy? Right? But he doesn't say that, right? So what happens is, because he doesn't say that, all you can do is reread the last line.
Yeah.
Where it says, and that was the last time I saw my father.
Yeah.
So here are like 8 words that are part of the vocabulary of a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody, right? This isn't like, hammy, show-offy spectacle. It's like the most unadorned, basic kindergarten level language, and it destroys you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because also it does remind you that there's that big movement, that big moment in your life that changed everything forever, that haunts you, that you dream about. You don't have the words for it.
Right.
Sorry about your luck.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So that's also true, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And a big theme in Chekov's whole body of work is failure to communicate. Where one of the first things that lets you know in this story, one of the first signals Cheever gives you to tell you that, people told you Cheever was a square, that he's straight. But the first clue he gives you to know that you're in the Twilight Zone and something's wrong, the narrator says, I hadn't seen my dad for years. I wanted to talk to him. So he had his secretary call me and book an appointment.
Right. That part, I like that detail, because yes, he can't just call his dad. He has to first speak to the secretary, set up an appointment.
So look at here's the reader, and then there's a fictional character that is his lens, and way over here in the distance is truth, and there's all these screens between you and truth. His dad's secretary calls him with the details. He treats people like furniture. He's rude, and he uses foreign words.
Yes.
Now, normally you choose words to improve communication, and he uses foreign words to make communication more difficult.
Well, and also isn't there also a sense that he does that because it sort of makes him seem more intelligent? Because, look at me, I speak multiple languages, right? I'm above you.
Right. Yeah. And also, when he's not talking down to people to make himself feel better, which is what we all do.
Yeah.
The only time he talks to his son, when the staff aren't around, he grills him about baseball trivia.
Yes. Yeah,
right?
he's still not capable of talking just about, hey, how you doing? What's going on in your life? Yeah.
Yeah, and again, that's why this story is the top of the mountain, because again, if I wrote a nonfiction book or a self-help book, like Tony Robbins said, oh, we don't say the things we should say. We have problems communicating. Come to my seminar, right? That's horrible, you know. But here's a story that takes 4 minutes to read, and you know that the reason the son is telling you this story, like, you know how it has this desperation, like the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner guy, where it's like, you have to listen to this, otherwise I'll just die.
Yeah.
It's because it matters. And all his the guy he wants to have communication with, all he can give him is baseball.
Yeah.
So right there, it's like, if Cheever had written 1 million words about 1 million words for the nonfiction section about how to improve your communication with your dad, right? You'd be like, oh, that's why art is where it's at, and art makes life better by helping you navigate your way through life and show, you know, and like showing you the score, right?
Yeah.
So there's all these layers and obstacles between you and real profound communication. And it kind of reminds me, I guess we'll talk about Joseph Conrad in a future episode, but Joseph Conrad was really good friends with the writer Ford Madox Ford, who's now famous for a book called the Good Soldier, which was Graham Greene's favorite novel of all time. And Ford and Conrad collaborated on a few books. They were buddies. And later in his life, Ford wrote down some of his reminiscences about hanging out with Conrad. And there's a lot of things in Joseph Conrad that seem like nervous tics until you realize it's not a flaw, it's a strategy.
Yeah.
Where he had a really interesting philosophy, like a philosopher, but fiction was the way he expressed it. And there were things he would do that seemed really like, in creative writing class, they said, don't do that. But it was part of a strategy to make a point. Yeah. So Ford Madox Ford said, and Joseph Conrad, spoiler alert, was kind of a downer.
Yeah.
Right? He wasn't really he wasn't really quick with the gags and the snappy patter. It was the life of the party. And he believed nobody ever really listens. Okay. And he thought, you know how oftentimes when you're having a conversation, the other person is saying something, but you aren't really listening to them. But what happens is while they're talking, in your head, you're already trying to formulate your clever response.
Right.
To show how you're the smart guy in the room.
Right.
Okay. And that's why the world's a mess, right? So Joseph Conrad believed nobody ever listens. And because of that, in his fiction, there's not a lot of dialogue, like stuff in speech tags, right? But whenever people talk in his whole body of work, they only ever talk in non sequiturs.
Interesting.
Okay. Which means, let's say I said, Keith, I'm wondering if I wasted my life. And then you replied by saying, how about those Toronto Blue Jays?
Yeah.
Okay. It's like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right. And I just happen to even like, I'm such a Conrad fan. I read nonfiction books about him. And I just saw Ford mention this. I'm like, oh, cool. Right. But if you don't know that fact, and you just read Conrad, the fact that everybody is talking non sequiturs just kind of makes it that much more spooky and strange and memorable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And well, that's part of his thing, right? Also, it's funny, because he learned French before English, oftentimes he'll have French syntax where in French the adjective comes after the noun. So he'll actually do things like that, where you might read that and say, "Oh wow, he's trying to be fancy," But like for Conrad, it's like, no, this is my fourth language. This is all I know, right? I've tried my best, right?
Right.
But it's another thing that just makes it spooky and cool, right?
Mhm.
So he had this idea that, guess what? The human race is doomed. No one ever listens. So because of that actual belief he had in his whole body of work, people communicate in non sequiturs, right?
Yeah.
And when you see that, it's like, wow, that's a smart idea. And even if it's not, and even if you aren't as nerdy as I am, that's kind of baked in, where it just makes it a more spooky, memorable ride. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that is cool. And I know, yeah, when you have an author that you really like, and you kind of start reading more about them and read, like you said, read nonfiction about them and stuff, you understand them more, and it really makes you appreciate their art a lot more. And I've only done that with a few people, that I really like that way. But for me, one of those is Philip K. Dick. I know you're not a huge fan of Philip K. Dick, but
Right.
what's really helped me, I think, to appreciate a lot of his stuff is that, like, I've actually gotten to know his last wife, Tessa Dick.
Really
And,
cool.
yeah. Friends on Facebook. I've corresponded with her a couple of times, and also I've read a lot of his friends are also science fiction writers, and in fact, one of them was a creative writing teacher at my son's school. My son went to the Orange County School of the Arts in Santa Ana, California, for high school, and one of the professors was a guy that is also a science fiction author and was a friend of Philip K. Dick's. And
what's his name?
I'm trying to remember his name now. I knew you were going to ask me that.
Oh man,
I can't remember his name now. I'll have to look it up. But yeah, so all that stuff is fascinating to me. Like reading about. I've read a bunch of his interviews that Philip K. Dick has done, and I guess for me the thing that was interesting too was like he had such an amazing life. I mean, there have been some attempts to make movies about his life, because he was such a strange person, and he had these really strange experiences, which, to be honest, are sort of like, well, maybe they're true, but then again, keep in mind he was a science fiction writer, so even some of those stories could just be interesting stories that he made up to make himself seem more interesting too. It's hard to know.
Yeah. Also, it's sometimes I wonder if if you want to understand a life, the last person to ask is the guy.
Right.
Right. Because I, tell myself lies about my life to make myself feel better,
Yes.
I don't really get how like he had multiple wives, and like,
yes,
I don't really get that. Like, I have one wife, and I think that's a good number.
I like that. Yes.
Yeah. And I always had this idea where I wanted my goal in life was for my books to get weirder and weirder, and for my personal life to get more boring and boring and boring.
Yeah, more normal. Yes.
Yeah. And it sometimes seems like creative types have this desire to make their life quote unquote interesting.
Yeah.
Where they end up having 5 wives or having all these adventures. And maybe that's just me, but I just read that and think, good Lord, save it for the page,
Yeah. Well, you know what? So that you bring up something, and I found this. I know people that are artists, so I know some painters. For some reason, I've noticed that my friends who are artists, like who are painters, or that create fine art or sculpture or thing like that. When some of them, when I hang out with them, I get this. There's this. You talk about philosophies. People have different philosophies and how it works into their art, right? And a lot of the ones I've talked to, and maybe this is true of other kinds of creative people, but I've only noticed it in people that, for some reason, that create sort of more visual art. But there's this sort of assumption that, all great artists have these tragic lives. And, like you think about all your favorite artists, and you study their lives, and you realize, oh man, they were married 5 times. And so, their child died, or their dad died when they were young, or they lived in poverty, or they were addicted to heroin, or, like they always have these horrible struggles. But then there's this belief that it's all that suffering they went through that what allowed them to create such great art. And if you believe that, and I know, like I said, I have friends who totally bought into this idea, there's almost a sort of subconscious and maybe even in some ways even a conscious decision. Like, I want to be a great artist, so my life needs to suck. I need to have a divorce. I need to do heroin. I need to experience. I need to be depressed. I need to, listen to sad music and cover up all the windows and sit in darkness. And like, I'm not kidding. I mean, I know people that like that almost feels like that's what they're doing to their life, because they think that the more dark and dreary and sad and gloomy their life is, that somehow that's going to make their art better. And I don't believe that. I don't think that is necessarily true. I mean, certainly good art can come out of suffering, sure, but I don't think it's a requirement. And I don't think, let me just say this about that. So when you look at those other artists and you say, wow, they went through so much suffering, that must have led to their art. You know what those guys didn't do? They didn't create suffering so that their art would be better. They just genuinely went through the crap, and it just happened to them. And I promise you, if you'd asked them, hey, would you like to get out of this? They'd be like, hell yes. They're not like, oh no, this is good for my art. Let's bring it on, pour it on, But I've noticed that about people. I've noticed like people who have that sort of attitude and will almost engineer their life to increase the suffering.
Yeah, that's something I actually have strong feelings about, and certainly, like I know, I've known writers where their personal life would get messy, and you'd look at that and say, oh, this is what happens when a creative person doesn't create.
Yeah.
Because you should be sitting at the typewriter just typing out words, but you don't feel like doing that for this season of your life. So instead, you're creating this drama out there in the real world and like hurting real people.
Yeah.
And that's just sad. And I have really strong feelings about that. It's like when people talk about inspiration. I actually think for a creative person, there's nothing more boring because it's just a bunch of nonsense. Like, inspiration doesn't mean anything. And like all that matters is like hard work, right?
Yeah.
And
I agree.
Johann Sebastian Bach, and you can disagree with Bach if you want to and think you're smarter than Bach, but he said, I'm not talented. Okay? He said, talent doesn't exist. I was successful because I worked hard. The harder you work, the more successful you are. The end.
Yeah.
Right? And that idea you were talking about, a lot of that comes from Ernest Hemingway. And I believe Ernest Hemingway is a horrible writer, a bad writer, who has had nothing but a deleterious influence on writing in the world. And then people said, and then when he was alive and he was hurting people, they would say, oh yeah, he's got some problems, but he writes like an angel. So that excuses his bad behavior.
Right.
Okay. First off, it doesn't. And his writing isn't good anyhow. Right. So it's like, no, there's nothing. Right.
Yeah.
But oftentimes you do see this in the art world where a person who makes good art, they're erratic, they're late, they're drunk, they're abusive. And like, oh, that's like part of the deal.
They're an artist. They're an artist.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. And like, it's not. You're still a human being, and you still have an obligation to your fellow man. And so Hemingway, horrible writer, but he managed to actually make people swallow this nonsense about how before you write it down, you got to live it up. You got to live it up and then write it down.
Right.
And this whole idea that his writing, which I think is horrible, has some profundity to it because he murdered a lot of endangered species.
Yeah.
Right. And because he shot an endangered lion,
right,
and he stabbed a bull, I have to care. No, I don't.
Yes.
And no. And the bottom line there is one of my big guiding lights in my creative life is Rembrandt van Rijn. And the thing about Van Rijn is, as his art got better and better, his finances got worse and worse until he eventually went bankrupt. And it looks like that's the trajectory that I'm going towards. So maybe that's part of the appeal there. But and he really shuts all those people up, because check out this. I think the psychological depth in his project, it probes Shakespearean depths. It's got everything you need in there, and yet in his whole life, he never traveled farther than 60 kilometers from the house he was born in. Right? So it wasn't
like
like
Jesus.
Oh,
yeah.
What?
Kind of like Jesus.
Yeah. So this whole thing about, I have to move to New York City and, shoot an elephant and have these adventures and have 5 wives and then I'll have something to write about. It's totally goofy.
Yeah.
It's like it's just the worst, and it's so unhelpful. And it's like, look at Shakespeare, right? Same thing, right? Where that guy worked hard, right?
Yeah.
And he wanted to write well, so we get paid more money.
Right.
And he started off as an actor and then got scripts and said, "Wow, these scripts suck. I bet I can write better scripts myself."
Yeah.
And he lived in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and he did. He wrote because he lived in the real world and he wasn't nobility and all that. He wrote plays that really resonated with the common people, and they were all the people that were going to the plays, right? So he put in jokes and phrases and jabs at the aristocracy and things like that people loved. I mean, they were like, "Yeah, damn right." Thanks for he put it the way it is, and they resonated a lot with that kind of stuff because he knew that stuff. He lived that way, and he wasn't afraid to put that into his scripts.
Yeah. Shakespeare is pretty like interesting in that regard. And I guess this is like, do you know how there are people who say Shakespeare didn't write those plays and all that stuff? Right?
I was going to say that. Like, I was curious what you thought about that, because I know there's these theories that have come out in the last probably 5 or 10 years that everything from there was no Shakespeare, that someone invented this guy as a character, and several different people wrote some of these plays under that name. So I've heard all kinds of different theories. There's even been a documentary made about that. Whether or not Shakespeare it was a real person, or maybe he was a real person, but he didn't write all these plays. Maybe he wrote 1 or 2, but some of the other ones were written attributed to him or things like that.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I actually have a strong opinion about that. And I gather in the early days of podcasts, you're supposed to be building a big tent and not offending people.
Let's do it. Let's just go for it. Rip off the Band-Aid.
Yeah, so basically, people who think Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare's play are scum of the earth. They're scum of the earth, and the idea that Shakespeare didn't write the plays is motivated by something I hate called snobbery.
Uh-huh.
And the people who think that just can't imagine that someone could do what Shakespeare did without having gone to an expensive school.
Yeah.
And been part of the elite class. And first off, if the past couple of years have taught us anything, it's that our elites are anything but. Yeah. And that, America has made mistakes on the other side of the planet that caused 1 million deaths in a place called Iraq, right? Yeah. And those mistakes were done by people who went to Harvard.
Yeah.
By the best of the best.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the guy with the hillbilly who with the pickup truck and the Trump bumper sticker, he didn't cause 1 million deaths in Iraq.
Right.
That was by the elites from the Ivy League. Right?
That's right. Yep.
But we still have this like really naive human thing about, oh, let's trust the experts, right? And
Yeah.
it's so ridiculous, right? So people say, well, how could someone of Shakespeare's dad was not literate, so how could Shakespeare have known about Venice and Denmark and all these places if he wasn't lord of the realm, right?
Right.
And it's like, well, maybe he knew people, maybe he asked, right?
Yeah.
Also, what's funny is if he was like a lord of the realm, how did he write the scenes with scumbags and riffraff so authentically?
Yeah.
Right. Also, there's a fact that the Earl of Oxford guy died like 10 years before The Tempest was written, so the timeline doesn't even make sense, right?
Right.
So basically, people who believe Shakespeare didn't write the plays, it's because Shakespeare doesn't fit. Where this gets back to myths that people have about creative types.
Yeah.
And they say that if you're a writer, you have to die in the saddle because it fits your romantic idea, like Beethoven and Rembrandt, where they die on the drawing table.
Right.
Right. Because that's the way it goes. Right.
Yeah.
And this whole idea that Shakespeare, and it sounds funny to say out loud. When he had enough money, he quit writing.
Yeah.
It's funny. Samuel Johnson said, "Nobody but a blockhead ever wrote, except for money."
Right.
Okay. So basically, what happened with Shakespeare is when he was like a teenager, he got Anne Hathaway pregnant, and no offense, but she wasn't the prettiest girl in town, and she was like 10 years older than he was, and then so they had this shotgun wedding because he got her pregnant, and then Shakespeare's like, "Bro, I don't even remember this girl because I was hammered. Give me a break."
Yeah.
And then the parents like, "No, shotgun wedding, you're going to do it," right?
Yeah.
So then he ends up marrying her, and then when he was 10, his son Hamnet died, and that's when he said, "Okay, that's it, I'm out of here." So he's like, "How can I get out of this situation that's a real drag?" Right? So he's like, "Oh, I know. If I go to London and say I'm an actor and I have to go there for work, that'll get me away from the old ball and chain." Right? And also in London, there was a lot more prostitutes than in his hometown, right? So he goes to London so he can, get away from the small town life and his obligations there. And like I said, the funny thing about people who say Shakespeare didn't write those plays, how could he have access to this knowledge about Venice or the Moors if he was just a commoner? When the fact is, if you actually read Shakespeare's plays, there's all sorts of evidence, chapter and verse, in front of your eyes that demonstrate the plays were written by an actor.
Yeah.
Big time. Like there's a bit, I think it's in Macbeth, where there's a big murder, and then this kind of porter guy comes out, starts cracking jokes like he's doing stand-up.
Right.
And like, what is that? What the hell's going on? And what's going on is this guy's entertaining you while Buddy has time to go backstage and wash the blood off and change his shirt and come back.
Yeah.
Right. And there's all these bits of business in there that show you these plays were written by an actor, not an earl or a duke or a genius, but a human actor, right?
Yeah.
So then the scripts, it's kind of funny. During his lifetime, there were a lot of other playwrights in town whose plays were really stiff and wooden, but they were classy people who had connections. So they would actually pay people to write bad reviews of Shakespeare to make themselves look better and all this stuff. And now nobody but scholars with this curiosity read these plays by Shakespeare's contemporaries, and they haven't survived, Shakespeare's have, right?
Yeah.
So then eventually it all culminates with The Tempest. And The Tempest is the play where Shakespeare lets you know that he knows how good he is. Okay, so that's what the Tempest is, right?
Yeah.
So basically, you know how the old joke in grade 10 is that, you know, it's a Shakespearean comedy if everyone gets married at the end, and you know it's a tragedy if everyone dies at the end.
That's right.
Right? And that's the rule, right? And then the Tempest breaks the rules, where there's all these things at the start of the Tempest that says, okay, this is a tragedy. Here's a guy who was wronged, and he spent 25 years plotting his revenge, and now he sprung his trap. Okay?
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, great. I've been to the theater before. I get it. And this is actually really genius, and it's really like a way of playing on the audience's assumptions. It's like when you watch Star Trek and you know they beam down, the guy with the red shirt is going to die, right? It's not going to be Spock who's going to die from the monster, right?
Of course, it's a red shirt.
Yeah, and it's like when you watch a horror movie and the teens are trapped in the forest, and one of them says, "I think it's better if we split up and go in different directions."
Always
right?
always the best idea.
Right? You laugh because we have this collective unconscious memory of going like, "Oh, I know how this plays out," right?
Yeah.
So when Shakespeare shows people the Tempest, they're like, okay, great. Now I'm going to watch Prospero get his revenge.
Yeah.
Okay. Because there's all these cues, like the red shirt in Star Trek, showing you this is how it has to go. Right. And if you break this rule, it'll be a revolution. It'll be like the end of the world. Okay. So then you're like, okay, great, sign me up. And then all this comedy happens, these like jokes from characters who don't matter and all this stuff. And then at the end, when he's about to spring his trap, he says, "Oh, guess what, Slick? I choose Christian forgiveness instead. Let's have a wedding."
Yeah.
Right. And you know, basically, Chekov is the best playwright since Shakespeare, and they both break rules like that about time and structure and these rules. So then in the Tempest, he says, all our revels are now ended, because what happened was, after working hard, Shakespeare finally had saved up enough money so he could buy a rental property.
Yeah.
Okay. So as soon as he had enough money to buy a rental property, he stopped writing and went back home and devoted himself to drinking full time. And then died at the bar with his face on the table, drunk and passed out at age 53.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And that's why these snobs, these uncreative armchair quarterbacks say Shakespeare, these plays couldn't have been written by William Shakespeare.
Right.
Because that the story doesn't seem to fit their romantic ideas.
Yeah.
But the fact that Shakespeare, who helped the human race so much, put into words these profound universals, was a hard-loving boozer from the wrong side of the tracks kind of guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Who drank himself to death at the age of 53, like he's like Bon Scott or something.
Yeah, exactly.
They're like, oh no, he did, like, you know, and like, no, he didn't go to school. Like he, like, you know, it's so such nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay.
I think yeah, you're totally right. Dead on. I mean, because really, I mean, how many truly great artists, if you were to kind of go down and make a list, you know, had some sort of a master's degree from Princeton or Harvard in, you know, English literature or something like it? None. Like it, they're always like, it's more about the talent, right? You have talent. You're good at writing. You pay attention to things. You're good at communicating, you know, emotion and truth and you know, the details of things and knowing the right things to choose, what to put in, what to leave out. That's really what makes you a good writer. Not I have this degree, or I studied under this thing, or you know what I mean? I mean, something. I mean, I guess those things could help, but by themselves, they, you know, because if that's what it was, then everybody with a PhD would be an amazing writer, and they're not.
Well, it's just such a crazy idea, and it's also such a recent idea. Where, as I've said before, most of human history, except for the past 5 minutes, the defining feature was lack, where a small percentage of the world's population since World War II has had a thing called free time.
Yeah.
Which my great grandparents never had.
Yeah.
Right. They didn't have have refrigeration. They didn't. So in the summer, they had to plan about how to survive, not freezing to death and starving when their house was covered in snow. All these things, right?
Yep.
And now we don't have lack, right? And part of what makes Shakespeare and Conrad and Rembrandt who they were was if they were idle or needed to take 10 years off to find themselves and work on their self-esteem, they'd be dead.
Yeah.
Right. So this whole thing about I'll go to a good school and study creative writing, right? Any great writer would have laughed in your face.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I hope we're doing okay for time, because there's still some points I'd like to cover.
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay, so basically, if you go to Google and type in "think about characters like a sphere," okay, if anyone who listens to this podcast is interested in writing or the arts, or wants to be an aspiring writer or an artist, most important thing, go to Google and type in "think about characters like a sphere." And it will lead you to an article from The Atlantic written by Paul Harding, who wrote a novel called Tinkers that won the Pulitzer Prize. And it's an article by him talking about why Cheever is great. And particularly, Paul Harding focuses on John Cheever's masterpiece, which is called The Jewels of the Cabots. And it's a masterpiece of misdirection. It really is the culmination of half a century of hard work, and is absolutely thrilling. And I put it on top of the mountain as far as American literature goes. Like, for me, I rate Bartleby the Scrivener by Melville really high, and The Jewels of the Cabots as far as America goes.
Okay.
And basically, the story starts off, and the guy basically says, "I'd like to tell you about a murder." So again, you've been around the block a few times. You have these expectations. And then for 20 or 30 pages, the narrator tells you about class in America, race in America, the history of America, love, longing, the neighbors, everything except what he promised.
Right. The murder.
Yeah. And then at the end of the story, he says, "Oh yeah, by the way, she poisoned him with rat poison." The end, right? But along the way, you get. It sounds crazy to say. Along the way, you kind of get like a history of America, where if you were going to show to the Martians what was the 20th century like, you could give them this, right? And basically, when the story's over, you go, "Wait, what just happened?" And it's actually spine tingling. You're like, the narrator promised you a murder mystery, but instead he gives you everything, but plus the kitchen sink, but the murder mystery. And you realize, and then you go back and say, "Well, what's the deal with this guy?" And it turns out he wants to indict these people, but he also inherited some money as well, so he's kind of implicated in the same system. So he'd be indicting himself, jibber jabber. And then you realize this is a story. And like I said, Chekov, he starts off being great and then just gets better and better as he gets more daring.
Yeah.
And says, I can play by the rules in my sleep. I want to break the rules. And The Jewels of the Cabot, possibly the greatest work of writing done in America since its history, is a story about not telling the story. It's a story about circumlocution. It's a story about not saying what has to be said because it hurts.
Yeah. because I'm glad you phrased it that way, because I was about to ask you, how is what he did in that story different from Clickbait? It's sort of like, oh, I read this, man, that looks interesting, I'm going to click on that, and then I click on it and I'm like, wait a minute, this is not what it said it was. You tricked me into reading about all this other stuff that's not what I clicked on. But so I like bringing out the point that it's about not telling the story. It's the art of not telling the story because it's too painful.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, in a sense, Reunion is kind of like the germ for his whole life, in the sense that, a father and son should say these profound things, like the complaint of What Work Is by Philip Levine, where like, why don't you break through and just do it, just grab him?
Yeah.
But instead we talk about baseball and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So the same thing happens here, where there are things that have to be said, but I'm never going to say them because it involves risk and pain.
Yeah.
Right. So basically, as Chekov got better and better as a craftsman, he was a craftsman and an artist. And as his craft got better, he was kind of like saying, well, what is my craft for? And he said, well, I want to search for truth with my craft. So then he's like, well, what are stories for? What's the meaning of life? Why, all this stuff. And he actually makes it work. And I just love him. And basically, in the Jewels of the Cabots, he's kind of like, again, it's like I said, if I said to you, do you want to read a book about ontology and teleology and epistemology? Any normal person would say, hell no, right? But there are these questions about, like in ontology, it's like, what is a thing for, right? It's like, here's a hunk of metal, and then I carve it so it has three prongs, and I say, it is now a fork. I'm imposing this meaning upon it.
Right.
Okay, so that's ontology, right?
Right.
And teleology is like, what is the ultimate purpose of a thing? Like, well, I say it's a fork, right? This is what it's for, right? All these things. So basically, in art, you can get away with talking about these things without people shutting you out because it's a fun ride. Exactly. So in this story, it's kind of like, well, what on earth is going on here, right? And it's really hard to talk about because it's so great. Anyhow, so here's a quote from the Jewels of the Cabots.
Okay.
Children drown. Beautiful women are mangled in automobile accidents. Cruise ships founder, and men die lingering deaths in mines and submarines. But you will find none of this in my account. In the last chapter, the ship comes home to port. The children are saved. The miners will be rescued. Is this an infirmity of the genteel, or a conviction that there are discernible moral truths? Mr. X defecated in his wife's top drawer. This is a fact, but I claim that it is not truth.
Wow. No, that's great.
So, maybe I'll just say that everyone should Google "Think About Characters Like a Sphere" and read Paul Harding's article about John Cheever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, I just looked it up. And in fact, what's funny is when I Googled Jack Cheever, the Jewels of the Cabots, the third thing that comes up is the Atlantic.com Think About Characters Like a Sphere. So
that makes sense.
There already is a connection point there.
Oh, okay. So it is really fantastic.
Yeah, this is good.
Okay,
well,
so
you're giving us some homework to do.
Yeah. So read the Jewels of the Cabots and read Think About Characters Like a Sphere, and it is. I just can't recommend it highly enough. So this concludes the John Cheever portion of the show.
That's right.
So if anyone is still listening.
Yeah, I'm sure they are.
Okay. So let me just. Also, yes. This is great. So what is art for, right? And as we said back in the day, we believe art is not a luxury or a frill or an afterthought or decoration, but it is something that is necessary to have a good life and to navigate your way through life. And if you reread Reunion, you can actually see a lot of is going on there that we should be thankful for. Like, what do you think about the dad, right? And it's funny, amateurs can't tell the difference between a diary entry and art, right?
Right.
And they think, oh, this feeling I had was an authentic feeling. Why can't no save it, right? I don't want to hear that. There is a difference. And if he just said, my dad's a douchebag, I don't want him in my life, I'm going to move to Sausalito, right? That's true, but who cares, right? So what do you think of the dad, right? Now, what's interesting is with just a few more brushstrokes, he could have painted the dad as a monster.
Right.
Right. And maybe the son did see him as a monster of like, man, I can't get this guy overloads me. I can't process him. He always makes me feel like a little worm, like a little baby. Right. You could have done a story about the dad as an ogre. Right.
Right.
Right. But Cheever doesn't do that. And sure, like if you were next to this guy in the restaurant, you go, man, I want to change tables. I don't want to be around this guy, right? Because you don't like douchebags.
Right.
But the way he's sketched, he's actually kind of pitiable. Because if you were a waiter, he'd be a villain.
That's right.
But as you read this story, you can pity him because you're like, here's this dumb bastard who never found the right words, right?
Yeah.
He knows the French word for waiter, but he doesn't know how to talk to his son about anything besides baseball.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's like, do you remember that guy you knew who got divorced from his fifth wife for the same reason he got divorced from his first wife?
Yeah.
You know that guy?
Philip K. Dick? Yeah.
Sure. Okay. And then you look at that guy and say, man, I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
Right. Hopefully I'll be able to learn from my mistakes and not lose my fifth wife for the same reason. Right. But people like that guy.
Yes,
right?
Of course.
And that's really rough. And here art is doing something that we need that you really can't do in other ways, where hopefully if you read great art like Reunion, it makes you look at your neighbor with more empathetic eyes.
Right.
And actually the science is settled. There have been scientific studies, if you care about science, that show that reading literary fiction increases your empathy for your fellow man.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. You know what? Yeah. I remember actually, I had a fascinating conversation. David Bentley Hart's one of my favorite theologians, but he also writes fiction. And I've interviewed him a couple of times in the past. And the last time I interviewed him, I wanted to talk to him about something theological. And he said, you know what? I'm really bored with that. I don't want to talk about, universalism or penal substitutionary atonement theory, or he's like, no, I don't want to talk about that. He goes, can we talk about literature? And we talk about art? And that was one of my favorite conversations with him, because that's exactly what we talked about. He was pointing out that so many theologians would be better served if they read great literature.
It's so true.
Yeah, because it would create an empathy for them, for people that aren't like them, people that don't think like them. It gives you a window into the humanity and the human soul of other people outside of your faith. And that's really the value of it. And I love that. That was just a really great conversation.
Yeah, it's so true. Like, it's funny how people like to talk about theology like it matters, when they could have been spending that time being a bit nicer or kinder,
Right. But maybe it's because if you're so always 100% focused on theology, you lose the importance of having empathy and caring about other people. You know what I mean? Like you kind of need to have not just a laser focus on theology, but also to have art. Like we were saying, we need art in our life to connect us to our own humanity, because otherwise we're in our heads and it just becomes about I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah. I hesitate to say this because it'll kind of derail the conversation, but oh well.
Go for it.
There's a guy in California named John MacArthur.
Uh-huh.
You probably heard of.
I think I've heard the name. Yeah.
You think I've heard of him? And he's rich and famous, and he's a Christian, like his trade is being a professional Christian, but he's rich, so it doesn't make any sense. I saw a sermon he did on the Good Samaritan, where he said this story is misunderstood. People don't understand it, but he's going to explain it.
Uh-huh.
And he says that when the unwashed, unsaved people hear this story, they think the moral of the story is like, oh, we should be kinder. But he says, no, that's wrong.
Oh, okay.
He said, you're way out to lunch, right? The story of the Good Samaritan is not a story exhorting humans to be kinder to each other. It is a story about how you can get eternal life, right, in the afterlife, right? So this story is about, it's for the elect. Only the elect can understand it, and if you're not part of the club, you're screwed. All this stuff, and went on for an hour. And when it was over, I really felt ashamed that I'd wasted an hour of my life watching it. But there were things where I wanted to take notes about it and to kind of respond to. But basically, here's a guy who's a multimillionaire who says, no. The moral of the story is not help the poor. And they actually mocked Christians who read this story and say, this story should inspire us to help the poor.
Uh-huh.
And he said, no, those people are suckers. That's stupid. Help, this story is about getting,
not giving, but getting. Yeah.
Getting.
Yeah.
Right?
You know what? There is, and I he's probably one of the main people who I think is pushing this sort of new narrative on Christianity, which is really disturbing. But I've seen several articles lately from people like MacArthur and from that direction, wanting to argue that empathy is a sin. And I'm like, I actually posted today on Facebook. I just posted, if empathy is a sin, Jesus was the Antichrist.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I'm not sure. I know like Americans probably don't like non-Americans commenting on America.
But we need it.
Yeah. So I wonder how freely I should speak about this, because I'm sure I know Americans don't I'm sure they could come back and talk about Canada or whatever, but
hey, look, it's your podcast, my friend. Say what you want to say.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny. Like I said, in the past, I would look at the stuff you were talking about and writing about, and I think to myself, oh wow, this is something that just doesn't interest me.
Yeah.
Right. I just don't care. Right. And it's funny, like in the West, we used to have this idea called live and let live. Right. And now it's kind of gone by the wayside because of social media and stuff. Right. Where like, if you don't agree with me, you must be shunned and all this stuff. Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm obsessed with three things. And I don't like going outside very much. Can you please leave me alone? Right. And if everyone did that, I think that'd be pretty cool. But no, people have this idea that my opinions are so great, they must be exported.
Right.
And I think that's really strange and very modern and very dangerous and nuts. Right. So anyhow, I just saw this, and this is kind of like, I guess they call it like a guilty pleasure, where I would watch, and it wasn't even a pleasure. where I've just watched these like John MacArthur sermons and go, my God, how's he do it? Right. And like, he's a multimillionaire, right? So basically he said, do not read the story of the Good Samaritan and be inspired to help the poor, because he said that's a scam. And he says that's a leftist socialist idea. Right. And he actually called out a guy named Jim Wallace and the Sojourners.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
Who said, and he said they justify helping the poor by the Good Samaritan parable, and that's how you know they're not elect.
Wow.
Right. And it's funny, it's on YouTube, and it's called The Most Misunderstood Parable. Right. So it's funny. So I'm watching this, and the first 4 minutes, he says, non-Christians read the story and think, oh, I should be kinder. And I thought to myself, imagine if everyone in the world, 7 billion people, if they were 1% kinder. How awesome would that be?
Yeah. Why would that be a bad thing? Yeah.
How awesome would that be? That'd be so great. But then he totally says, no, screw that. That's for suckers. And then talks about how there's actually a hidden code in there beneath that about how you can get. Right? How it's kind of like, you know how you might say like, oh, if you're kind to your neighbors, that might be a signal that you have eternal life. I was, no. Skip that. Just go straight to the eternal life without the kindness, because kindness is for leftists.
Yeah, but this is the problem when this is why I wrote that book, Jesus Untangled, because in the West, faith and politics have become so entangled with one another. This is the lens by which all Christians see the world, and so I have friends who are pastors who have attempted to do like a series of sermons on like the red letters. I'm just going to preach. Let's do like a month where I just preach from the red letters or the words of Jesus. And by the second, or sometimes by the first sermon, after the first sermon or second sermon, people are complaining that you sound like a socialist, or you sound like a Democrat. Why are you getting so political? And it's like, well, it's because everybody has a political lens. So they're incapable of hearing Jesus talk about these kind of things without interpreting it through a political lens. And so they hear it as, oh, you're advocating for, leftist thoughts, or you're a socialist, or like, no, I'm just telling you what Jesus said. And this idea that it's not just the sermon, it's not just the Good Samaritan. I mean, the whole Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 25, this famous passage where Jesus talks about the judgment day, and he says, hey, by the way, what if when you die and go to heaven, God judges you based on how well you treated the poor or loved your enemies? Like, what if the judgment looks like this? He calls all your neighbors up and asks them to testify about whether or not you cared about them and loved them, and when you were hurting, did you ever call them and come alongside them? When they were hungry, were you the one that bought them a sandwich or something? And what if it was based on that? And my thing is, why would you think it would be any different? Because it sure seems like Jesus is strongly suggesting that those are the things that in the end will really matter. How well did you love? How much were you concerned for your neighbor? Because, I mean, come on, didn't Jesus say the two most important things are love God and love your neighbor as yourself? Or love one another the way I loved you? How is it not about love? How is it not about compassion? The idea that a pastor of a church, a mega church, with a huge platform, by the way, not only has he written books, he has
millions.
Millions. He's got a TV show, radio show, like he's everywhere. How can this guy stand up and say, if you love your neighbor the way Jesus tells you to, you're not a Christian?
That's for suckers.
How is that not blasphemy? To me, that's if the idea, like if we really believed what Jesus said, to me, the greatest blasphemy is the failure to love your neighbors yourself. Like, because that's supposed to be the greatest command.
So crazy.
How could it be anything else?
And it's funny about how like it's all okay because he's not gay, right? Because that's the worst thing. Right?
Yeah.
Because they always say there's a part in Leviticus where it says being gay is an abomination. So as long as you're not gay,
Yeah.
you're the chosen one, and you get a gold star, right?
Right.
But the funny thing is, if you actually read Leviticus, on the same page, it also says going to Red Lobster is an abomination that is just as bad.
Yeah, and eating a cheeseburger is
Literally.
also enough to send you to hell.
Yeah. And it's so funny. Like I said, I don't care about politics or, the American Christianity industry. I like three things, and I talk to my wife, and that's about it. But I'm like, man, these ideas are really crazy. This is really nuts.
Yeah.
And here's a guy who's telling millions of people that the Good Samaritan isn't about being kind, right? And it's kind of funny. Like, you had your top 10 list of reasons why people shouldn't vote, and I actually found a new one. So you can update that blog thing.
Okay.
So check out this. Write this down. This is wild. Okay.
Okay.
Every president drops bombs.
Yep.
Okay. And every politician is part of a network that drops bombs. So when you vote, every single time you vote, you are voting in favor of dropping bombs.
Yep.
And we're assuming Jesus said, love your neighbor, which would preclude turning them into glowing ash.
Yeah. Yeah. If Jesus is serious about this whole thing about loving your neighbor, then I don't know. I think maybe we shouldn't kill them. That's probably step one. Don't kill them. Because it's hard to love someone who's dead or that you're dropping bombs on.
Yeah, pretty strange. And when it comes to theology, I had this idea where we'd be a lot better off if we got our theology from Soil and Green, which was featured in episode 2 of this podcast.
Yeah.
Where basically, if you get your theology from Soil and Green, Edward G. Robinson won't ask you for 10% of your income. First off, plus check out this: in Soil and Green, people treat each other like furniture, and they're honest enough to call each other furniture.
Yeah.
So basically, instead of like marrying a hot young trophy wife and saying, "Oh yeah, she's my wife, it's true love," the guy's just honest and says, "It's about money, ego boost, dopamine. You're my furniture. When you start to sag, you'll be replaced."
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the big question is, do you treat other people like furniture? And I think if you want to know if you're part of the elect, if you even care, and I guess I don't care, is how do you treat cashiers?
Yeah.
Right. And waitresses.
Yeah.
And like, if you want to know if you're born again, at the end of the day, if you look back and look about how you talk to cashiers, I think that'll tell you.
Exactly.
And like, if you were impatient with the cashier, or treated her like she was invisible, or treated her like a tool who was only there to accomplish your end, then you're gonna burn in hell. Sorry about your luck there.
Yep.
Yeah. So who did you treat like furniture today?
Yeah. Exactly. And that's funny, because I'm sure you did that on purpose. You brought us all the way back around to our story about a dad who treats waiters like crap.
Yeah, actually, it might be hard for the viewer to believe, but I actually wrote notes here. This actually did have a plan.
Damn it, boy, you were smart. You worked this out.
So now we're almost back on track.
Okay.
So basically, Soil and Green says don't treat people like furniture. Okay. Again, like we saw last week when we talked about the doctor's visit by Chekov, the father, who is a few brushstrokes away from being a villain and a monster, we can't go there because he's too human, he's too much like us, and he's also doomed and pathetic, and he just never found the words, and it's sad. So basically, there was a saint named Simone Weil who it's kind of hard to talk about because, to be honest, she was a very strange person, but I think she was also kind of like a saint. And she wrote an essay about Homer, and I kind of think that essay is kind of like a skeleton key for understanding the modern age and also maybe understanding life in general. So she wrote this essay about Homer, and in the essay, she says that the real protagonist of the Iliad is force. Okay, so the idea is that in the Iliad, like someone is stabbing you and they say, I'm stabbing you because you stabbed Tom, and you stabbed Tom because Tom stabbed Jerry.
Right.
So sorry about your luck, but I am choosing to do this because of whatever, right? When actually, if you step back, being free to choose to stab someone is not being free.
Right. Exactly. I'm not doing it. Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. No one is free in that sequence. Everyone is doing it. I'm doing this because you did that, but you did that because he did this. And so it all kind of goes back to some original thing that we have no free will in these. Well, it seems that we have no free will. In a way, we do, but when we act like that, what we're saying is we don't have free will.
Right. So there's all this beauty and these speeches saying, I'm going to stab you because of this reason. And then you read this beautiful page of writing, go, man, that's great. Go ahead and stab him. Right. Because he killed your grandpa or whatever it is.
Yeah, he deserves it.
But then you realize actually that's the cover story. And these people are actually puppets.
Yeah.
And the only free agent in this world is force. And in all of the Iliad, there's only one person who notices, and that's Helen. And Helen is ostensibly the person who sets this whole nightmare in motion, because she had the faith that launched 1,000 ships, right?
Right.
So now she's sitting here on the balcony watching all this slaughter, and she's like, they're doing this for me. I'm telling them to stop. And she actually sees through it and sees that, good Lord, we're all trapped in a deterministic world. And the only agent is force, and we are just its puppets on a string.
Yeah.
And we invent these cover stories where it's like, let's say the alcoholic says, I am free to choose between Jim Beam and Jack Daniels. Right? Yeah. So I'm free, USA. Right?
Right.
And like, well, no, you're telling yourself you're free, but you're not free.
Yeah.
Right? Or like, wow, there's billionaires in the world, but in exchange, I can go to Walmart and there's 50 different kinds of cereal. So I have 50 different choices of cereal, so that increases my fruit. No.
Right.
I don't want any cereal. Shove it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the only person who realizes that is Helen. And in this essay, Simone Weil, and this is the big skeleton key, she defines force as that X which reduces the recipient to a thing.
Okay.
Okay. So it's kind of funny. Like, I understand that John MacArthur might have more YouTube subscribers than we do, right? I hear that might be but I think this is actually a better hot ticket to the afterlife, whatever, right?
Yeah.
If you read Simone Weil and say that X which turns the recipient to a thing, because let's say you meet a person and go, wow, there's this huge web and matrix of all these experiences and memories and all these things. And the next person you meet, what if you said, wow, they are more wonderful than an angel?
Right.
And they are endlessly valuable and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But instead, in the interest of time, I just say, no, you're like just a thing. Bring me my spicy fries and get out of here.
Right.
Right. So Simone Weil on Homer, she said that, and I think that's a pretty good skeleton key.
Yeah, I like that.
Maybe better than John MacArthur.
Although, I would totally agree.
Yeah. So basically, that leads us, according to my notes here, to Gooseberries by Anton Chekov. And this is kind of funny, where again, Chekov is writing in a society that has a lot more social mobility than ours does, as I mentioned. So his characters are even more stuck than we are, where they don't have a lot of options, but they're a bit more honest than we are.
Uh-huh.
Like, you're not going to become a billionaire tomorrow, but the American dream says if you try hard and work more overtime, just hang in there, champ, and it might work out.
Right.
Right. And of course, there are some people who benefit from making you swallow that lie, right?
Of course.
Yeah. And I actually had a note about that. It's kind of interesting. Okay, so we'll come to that. So basically, Gooseberries is a story by Anton Chekov, and the joke is, it's such a great story. It'll give you goosebumps. See that? That's like a play on words.
Got it.
Okay. So it has a great opening, and as a little digression for writers, aspiring writers, make another note. There's a book you should get called The Story Begins, which is written by Amos Oz. And Amos Oz is an Israeli novelist who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he has a great book called The Story Begins. And what he does is he takes 8 or so famous short stories and analyzes their openings.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it's just the best book. And he basically says that a story is like a seduction, where, you know how in 1984, the first sentence says all the clocks in London were striking 13.
Yeah.
Right? So you can read that and say, bah humbug, clocks don't strike 13, this is balderdash, and then throw the book against the room. Or else you can say, what? And you can respond to the seduction and say, seduce me, take me along for the ride.
Right.
Right? And it's just really good inside baseball bit about how stories work. Anton Chekov has a great story called Rothschild's Fiddle. And the first sentence in the story is, hang on. The town was a little one, worse than a village, and it was inhabited by scarcely any but old people who died with an infrequency that was really annoying. So you read that opening line and you're like, what? Right? And then you read on and find out that the main guy in the story is a coffin maker. Right. And because that people living is bad for business.
Yes.
And death is good for business. So people living and being alive brings him down. And then he starts to complain that that he isn't making coffins in the big city, because if he was, then people would call him Mr.
Right.
Instead of just Ivan. And then as the story goes along, he remembers he has a wife. He remembers that a long time ago, he had a son, but the son died, and it hurts so bad, him and his wife haven't even mentioned it for all these years. And there are all these buried levels. And the story really hurts. It really hurts. And at the end of the story, he dies, because that's what everybody does.
Right.
And he's swallowed up by the passive time and his fiddle goes to someone else. And it's really upsetting. And it starts off with that opening about people died with an infrequency that was really annoying. And as soon as you say that, if you're like, my kind of guy, you'll be like, sign me up, right?
Right.
Take over, right?
Right.
So basically, we're going to talk about a story called Gooseberries, which kind of ties into this whole thing about.
Sorry about that.
Here's a guy who should be a villain, but he's not quite a villain because he's still a human being. So basically, in the story of Gooseberries, there's a guy who has a goal, and his goal is to be a big shot and have enough money so we can have a house in the country. And he wants to grow gooseberries on his country estate and not have to buy gooseberries from Walmart, but buy them from his own field on his mansion, his country estate where he has servants. That's his thing.
Right.
So then, as the years go by, his dream comes true. Okay, and he gets what he wants. And along the way, he treats people like furniture to accomplish this goal. Like he marries someone he doesn't love just because she's rich, all this stuff, right? And then at the end, he gets what he wants. And when he gets what he wants, you look at him and you think, the TV told me I should envy this guy.
Yeah.
Because he has servants. And for some reason, I don't envy him, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the funny thing is, Satan, let's call him Satan, play along.
Okay.
Satan, or the billionaire class, or whatever terminology you want to say, wants us to spend our life chasing the American dream and treating our neighbor like furniture. Because if we do that, we'll be dead really quickly without ever giving Satan any problems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. And I think it's good to think about it in that terms, like to recognize that there are powers in the world who benefit from the world being the way it is, and to sort of ask those questions. And again, I think good art can help you to ask those questions and to sort of say, why are things the way they are? Who benefits from the world being this way, and from us living in a society where people believe, and we do, right? We live in a society where people believe the best things possible would be to be if I could be on a reality show, or if I could have if I could have 1 million followers on Instagram, or you know what I mean? And we believe that, it's sort of like, and it's the inversion of what Jesus says. Jesus doesn't say, blessed are the rich, blessed are the famous, blessed are those who have a 401k and in a house in the Hamptons. But that's the world we live in, where we have been slowly convinced that that's what it means. That's the good thing. That's what we should be seeking. But then there's another question, as you're saying, behind that, which is, not just why do I think that, but who benefits from me living that way and acting as if these are the only things that matter? Because once you start really digging behind that, you really do recognize that it's not for your benefit. They don't have your best interest in mind when they want you to
That's
live
right.
that way.
Yeah, they are not your friends.
Right.
Yeah, and it's pretty sad. Like, people. It's funny to think about the amount of time people spend thinking about celebrities when that celebrity you were thinking of thinks about you never.
Right.
So you kind of made a bad bet there.
That's right.
Right. So, Terence Malic, he once said, unless you love, your life will flash by.
I love Terence Malic, by the way. Phenomenal.
Yeah. So he said, unless you love, your life will flash by.
Yeah.
So again, we saw in that story, The Doctor's Visit by Chekov, the people you're supposed to envy. It's like, my God, you're even more Satan's puppet than I am. Right?
Yeah.
And I should hate you, but I just want to go home and get the hell out of here, you know?
Right.
That's the real truth of art here. And also, to be a bit more inside baseball, one thing that's great about Chekhov is, you know how when you start out to be a writer, you're like, I have to be a writer because I have so much to say, and the world has to hear my genius and my deep thoughts. That's horrible. That's the worst reason to write, right? And Chekhov knows those profound show-off bits in your writing. A little of that goes a long way.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Where please, right? Save it, right?
Yeah.
So this story actually has a bit like that. Like, you know how Dostoevsky is like, imagine being trapped in an elevator with a speed freak who won't shut up for 3 hours and the elevator is stuck, right?
Right.
It's like he's always going on about, you know, these deep thoughts, right? It's horrible. And this story actually has this deep thought action that's really profound and great, but it's seamlessly woven into the ride where it doesn't call attention to itself. So
yeah. Yeah.
I think this whole thing about John Cheever, Simone Weil, and John MacArthur, and Soylent Green. And by the way, that's the first time in history those four things have all been in the same sentence.
I'm pretty sure.
Right? I think they'll wind up together in a nice payoff with Gooseberries
Yeah.
by Anton Chekov. So check this out. So just listen to this. Ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
Yeah. The whole sky had been overcast with rain clouds from early morning. It was a still day, not hot, but heavy, as it is in gray, dull weather when the clouds have been hanging over the country for a while, when one expects rain and it does not come. Ivan Ivanovitch, the veterinary surgeon, and Birkin, the high school teacher, were already tired from walking, and the fields seemed to them endless. Far ahead of them, they could just see the windmills of the village. On the right stretched a row of hillocks, which disappeared in the distance behind the village. And they both knew that this was the bank of the river, that there were meadows, green willows, homesteads there, and that if one stood on one of the hillocks, one could see from it the same vast plain, telegraph wires, and a train which, in the distance, looked like a crawling caterpillar, and that in clear weather, one could even see the town. Now, in still weather, when all nature seemed mild and dreamy, Ivan Ivanovitch and Birkin were filled with love of that countryside, and both thought how great, how beautiful a land it was. The last time we were in Prokofy's barn, said Birkin, you were about to tell me a story. So now my question is, does that make you want to keep reading?
Yeah, I guess.
So it's funny. So one thing Chekov does is he'll often start a story where two people are fishing or on a train,
Yeah.
and they start telling a story out of boredom, and that's the story.
That's the beginning of the story.
I think he stole this idea from Kenny Rogers and the Gambler.
That's right.
Right, where the boredom overtook us.
Yes.
So they just started to talk, right? So then he starts telling him the story about his brother. Okay. And like I said, time goes by. The brother gets what he wants. He gets to be a big shot with a huge palace in the country with servants and gooseberries. Okay. So his brother watches this. And in the evening, when we were drinking tea, the cook put on the table a plate full of gooseberries. They were not bought, but his own gooseberries, gathered for the first time since the bushes were planted. Nikolai Ivanovich laughed and looked for a minute in silence at the gooseberries, with tears in his eyes. He could not speak, for the excitement. Then he put one gooseberry in his mouth, looked at me with the triumph of a child who has at last received his favorite toys, and said, "How delicious." And he ate them greedily, continually repeating, "Ah, how delicious, do taste them." But in reality, they were sour and unripe. Okay, so it's kind of funny. Like, again, one thing that this podcast is about is saying, what do you think is important, right?
Yeah.
And the bad guys want you to think, the Kardashians are important, or dropping bombs is important, or whatever.
Right.
And I think daydreaming and looking at leaves is important.
Right.
That's my thing, right?
Exactly.
So here, just imagine like this guy hurts all these people to finally get a Ferrari, and then the Ferrari breaks down.
Right.
Right? Or he hurts all these people to get gold, and it turns out it's like fool's gold.
Right.
Right? It's crazy. Okay. So anyhow, here comes the big windup. And this is really wild. Okay. Oh man. I saw a happy man whose cherished dream was so obviously fulfilled, who had attained his object in life, who had gained what he wanted, right? And it's kind of funny. Like, you want what you want, right? But, like Oscar Wilde, he said there are two great tragedies in life. One is not getting what you want, and the other is getting it.
And the other one is getting it. Exactly.
Well, what if you get what you want, and it turns out you made a bad bet? Like that whole plan you had when you were 19, right? You're right, like you were wrong.
Right.
Right? Like that's possible. Like, like you've changed your mind since you were 20, but then you thought you were right, and you think you're right now.
Right.
That's a problem.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And again, I don't want to derail us either, but it's so odd because I was thinking,
don't.
Maybe we should have named this podcast derailing the conversation, but that's kind of been our theme. But I don't think it's derailing at all. I think it's actually just reaffirming what you're saying, because again, in a previous episode, I don't remember which one it was, but in a previous episode, we talked a little bit about Rene Girard, and Girard's whole thing was that man's biggest problem essentially is our desires, right? And this gets back to exactly this whole thing we're talking about, this thing you want, what you desire, what you want, and how that in itself is a reflection of your inner life, your inner soul. And quite often that's the root of all evil. It's this desire we have, that we desire something in a way that it consumes us, and that in a way, like that's part of our problem. When our desires for things, for riches, for money, for fame, whatever these things are, or things that belong to other people, we want these things because we see other people with them and they look happy. So if I have them, I'll be happy too. That really is like kind of our biggest problem.
Well, it's funny, like, without going into too much detail, I have desires that are disordered, and I desire things that are bad, and that's kind of warped my life out of shape. And so I'm going to do things today that I want to do, but then when I finish doing them, I'm like, man, I didn't really want to do that. Why am I doing this? Why can't I stop doing it?
Right.
And the good news is that's made me kind of humble,
mm-hmm.
which I think is a good thing. Where humble in the sense that I can't imagine being like John MacArthur and standing up in front of a soccer stadium and saying, I know what Jesus meant.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah. It's like, because of my disordered desires, that kind of makes me want to be left alone and not talk to people unless we're talking about Chekov or spaceships or comics or something.
Right.
So, and I'm just surprised when I find other people who don't have that thing. And like, I guess you'd say John MacArthur is a sociopath, which in America is a good thing to be.
Oh yeah, it's celebrated. We just redefine it in such a way. We don't call it that, but we call it something else.
Yeah, and again, like when your pathology becomes more common, it becomes more invisible.
Yeah, exactly right.
And it's like, yeah, and it's like, well, John MacArthur's a bigger house than I do, so he has to be right, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So he's not a sociopath because he pays more in taxes than I do or something, right?
Right. He can't be wrong because he's successful. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so, you know, it's funny. You know, like in the song Idiot Win by Bob Dylan, he says, we're all idiots. It's a wonder we can even feed ourselves, right? And it's kind of funny, like that's something you don't hear too much anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we're impressed by big shots and all this, but I'm like, where have you been? We're all idiots.
Right.
Right. And our desires are disordered, and it seems pretty hopeless to me, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, and the narrator here is the brother of the guy who has the gooseberries.
Mm-hmm.
So, here's a story about a guy who got what he wanted. He wanted gooseberries, and he got them. So check out this. I saw a happy man whose cherished dream was so obviously fulfilled, who had attained his object in life, who had gained what he wanted, who was satisfied with his fate and with himself. There was always, for some reason, an element of sadness mingled with my thoughts of human happiness. And on this occasion, at the sight of a happy man, I was overcome by an oppressive feeling that was close upon despair. It was particularly oppressive at night. A bed was made up for me in the room next to my brother's bedroom, and I could hear that he was awake, and that he kept getting up and going to the plate of gooseberries and taking one. All through the night. I reflected how many satisfied, happy people there really are. What a suffocating force it is. You look at life, the insolence and idleness of the strong, the ignorance and brutishness of the weak, incredible poverty all about us, overcrowding, degeneration, drunkenness, hypocrisy, lying. Yet all is calm and stillness in the houses and in the streets. Of the 50,000 living in a town, there is not one person who would cry out, who would give vent to this indignation aloud. We see the people going to market for provisions, eating by day, sleeping by night, talking their silly nonsense, getting married, growing old, serenely escorting their dead to the cemetery. But we do not see and we do not hear those who suffer. And what is terrible in life goes on somewhere behind the scenes. And everything is quiet and peaceful, and nothing protests but mute statistics. So many people gone out of their minds, so many gallons of vodka drunk, so many children dead from malnutrition. And this order of things is evidently necessary. Evidently, the happy man only feels at ease because the unhappy bear their burdens in silence. And without that silence, their happiness would be impossible. It's a case of general hypnotism. There ought to be behind the door of every happy, contented man someone standing with a hammer, continually reminding him with a tap that there are unhappy people, that however happy he may be, life will show him her laws sooner or later. Trouble will come for him. Disease, poverty, losses, and no one will see, and no one will hear, just as now he neither sees nor hears others. But there is no man with a hammer. The happy man lives at his ease, and trivial daily cares faintly agitate him like the wind in the aspen tree, and all is well.
Wow, man, that is awesome. What a great, is that how it ends?
No, but I don't have time to read the whole story.
That is a great, man, that is just a great, that paragraph is awesome. So good. I love that the silence of the unhappy is sort of like what is necessary for the happy to continue to be happy. I like that.
Actually, since you asked, I'll tell you how the story ends.
All right,
okay?
spoiler alert, everybody.
Spoiler alert, okay? Lord, forgive us sinners, he said, and put his head under the quilt. The rain was pattering on the window panes all night.
That's great.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert, yeah. That's
so it's kind of funny, like people like to, and here's a controversial opinion. People talk about Dostoevsky being a great writer, and I call him an undergraduate's writer, where people like Dostoevsky because he gives you a lot of stuff to write your essays about.
Uh-huh.
But no, right? And for me, if you really want to tell me what's better than Dostoevsky, blah blah blah, is Anton Chekov saying, "But there is no man with a hammer."
Yeah, I do. I love that. That line is great. But there is
and we need one.
Yes, we do. And in a
and
way,
the funny thing is,
isn't that Chekhov? He's the man with the hammer.
Oh man, that's good. They should put that as a blurb on his next book. He's the man with the hammer.
The man with the hammer.
And it's kind of funny too, like at the start there, when the brother of the guy with the gooseberries says it comes on stronger at night, this feeling of despair, that's actually truth encroaching.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Oh yeah.
Where he's like, oh wow, like the last time I saw the news, and like I hate the news. I don't want to hear news, right?
Right.
Last time I heard the news, they said Rihanna just became a billionaire.
Oh, good.
Right?
I'm so glad to hear that.
Right. And the way it was reported, it's like you're supposed to celebrate.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, let's go out to eat.
And it's like, she doesn't care about you. Why do you care about her? Right.
Right.
But it's like, great news, America. Rihanna's a billionaire.
Right.
Right. So there's like, okay, great. Rihanna's doing better than me. I'm doing better than some people. I'm going to keep my head down and soon I'll be dead. And that's it. Right.
Yeah.
But then this guy sees this guy going back and forth to the fridge all night to eat these gooseberries like a junkie. And he feels this feeling creeping towards his bed. And he thinks it's despair. But it's actually something like the man with the hammer.
Right.
Right. And again, it's funny, how like morons think prophecy means fortune telling.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
When no, Chekov is like prophecy is what Chekov does. Where basically, if someone like Isaiah comes along and sees like an unjust system and says, this is a house of cards, and then 30 years later the system collapses, my God, he told the future. No, he didn't tell the future. He was just not an idiot.
He told the truth, in other words. Yeah.
Right.
This has no future. This can't continue.
Yeah. So what if this feeling, it's like now in 2021, is you say, man, I feel despair because my life is meaningless. You'll be told, great, take a pill. And like, no, what if you're right? What if the way you're living is meaningless?
Right. And instead of taking a pill, what you should do is change the way you're living your life.
Yeah.
Imagine that. Yeah, it's very similar to, it reminds me of, I think I mentioned one of the, maybe even last episode, that I had written years ago. I had written this short story that we turned into a comic called Hard Video. And it was long before we had these devices, which we all have now, iPhones and social media and all that stuff. And it was sort of like a warning, like, hey, can you imagine a world where everybody was carrying these devices and didn't know how to relate to other people apart from these devices, and how it sort of dehumanized us and it kept us from having empathy and all these kind of things. And that was what my story was about. But one of the taglines that I had for the story was, what if, I only so I remember how I phrased it. What if instead of escaping reality, we just made reality a place we don't need to escape from?
Right.
Because so much of what we, that's why there's an entertainment industry. That's why there's a pharmaceutical industry, selling you Xanax or Zoloft or whatever. It's because we have created a reality that is brutal and painful and soul-sucking and brutal, and rather than change that reality into one that doesn't chew people up and spit them out, we say, well, watch the Kardashians, or play video, go buy an Xbox or whatever, you know what I mean? So there's all these distractions, or maybe it's just a bottle of Jack Daniels, right? Or Jim Beam or whatever. But we just have these industries built on, numbing the pain of the reality, the society and the reality we've created, rather than putting all that same amount of money and energy and effort into saying, I know what we should do. Why don't we instead just make this reality one that we all enjoy living in it, and everybody gets to share the same level of happiness and humanity and beauty and all that, instead of, so yeah, it's just, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. And I guess most of the time we don't want to think about it.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Faith of Our Fathers by Philip K. Dick is about, where there's a guy who thinks he's having a rough day because he's tripping, when really he's having a bad day because the drug is wearing off and everyone else is tripping.
Right.
Right. So this is kind of the big question about what is real. How do I live my life in a way that, you want to live your life in a way that is not absurd.
Mm-hmm.
And ideally, you don't want to waste your life. Right.
Right.
So to do that, you have to figure out what is real. And if some amateur writer wants to write about reality and all this stuff, or think they'll be like Philip K. Dick, that's not how it works. And Chekov can get away with it because he's such a master artist. But this is why voting is so goofy, right? Because the idea is oh wow, something's wrong with the world, and what's wrong with the world is the other.
Yeah.
Oh gee, you're so lucky that the problem isn't with you; it's with the other guy.
Right.
The guy with the mustache, the whatever, right? It's so crazy.
Yeah.
And that's why in Chekov here, he says it is a case of general hypnotism, where for the scam to work, everyone has to buy it.
That's exactly right.
Just like money is a mutually shared illusion, where here's a piece of paper that says 20 on it, so we all agree
that it's worth 20. Yes, but it's just
right.
a piece of paper with a symbol on it and a word on it. Yeah, and people kill each other for those pieces of paper. Yeah.
Yeah, but if we stop believing in it, It's a Wonderful Life, when there's a run at the bank because people don't have faith in the Bailey savings and loan anymore. Right. So they say, I want to withdraw my cash. And then Jimmy Stewart's like, well, your cash isn't here. We don't have it. It represents an idea.
Yes.
That was founded on trust. And the people are like, well, the trust is gone. I want my piece of paper.
Right.
Right.
That's exactly right.
So that's where so it's just so great about how it talks about how for this whole system to work, there has to be Rihanna having $1 billion, but there also has to be the chumps like us with our Xboxes watching Rihanna, who still have other people to look down on, like the homeless, like this great chain of being. And the this passage has such rhythm and meter to it, where when he finally says, "We need a man with a hammer, but there is no man with a hammer," it's just so perfect. And Russell Banks, he was a novelist, and he wrote the Affliction, which was turned into the movie with James Coburn.
Yeah.
And he also wrote the movie The Sweet Hereafter, like the novel The Sweet Hereafter.
Yeah.
And Russell Banks said, on reading Chekov, we first grow ecstatic, and then we grieve. For he's one of those writers whose spiritual and literary intelligence is so powerful that for a moment we are seduced by our pleasure into believing in human progress, in the moral evolution of the species. Then, a moment later, we see that he is in fact only a giant, an anomaly, possibly an angel, and that we may not have another like him for 1,000 years.
Wow, that's awesome. Great quote.
So it's kind of funny, like it's actually true, where you read Chekov and go, man, maybe this human race has something to offer for it. Maybe we should tell the Martians not to kill us because we have this guy.
Right.
And then you go, no, there was just this one guy. He was just like a,
Yeah, he was a savant.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so here's a funny question. What's the difference between art and porn? Art makes you feel less alone, and porn makes you feel more alone.
Right.
Okay.
That's good.
So when you go to watch your porn, you watch the thing you like, and you use these people like tools. And when it's over, you close the window and go on about your day.
Yeah.
And art makes you feel less alone, and porn makes you feel more alone. And reading Chekov makes you a better person because you realize the things you went through today are universal.
Right.
You read Chekov and say, I'm not a cobbler in Siberia. Why am I crying reading about this cobbler in Siberia?
Right.
When the details are so far removed. And it's because we all are floating forward on the river of time. We do these universal things. And Chekov is the man with the hammer, as they say.
Yeah, I love that. I like that, actually, the man with the hammer.
Yeah.
Well, this is good. I mean, and this is, I think, what we're trying to do in this podcast is illuminate some of these things, that again, what makes art so necessary for our life and our humanity. And I think this is wonderful because, like, in a way, we're also now holding the hammer, right? We're kind of that annoying little guy with the hammer going, hey, don't forget this.
And it's so much more interesting than art with good guys and bad guys.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can do that. You can even do the kind of things that Chekov's doing and in a story with good guys and bad guys, but it's got to be more than that.
Oh man, it's just so wild how like like basically if you read all of Gooseberries, which everyone who hears this should, it's the story about a guy who has an obsession. But because he wins the game of life, we wouldn't go, oh wow, you're a weirdo. We'd say, hey, you're a success, you made it, right?
Right.
And it's like, how in our society, money has this liquidity to it that kind of masks our hoarding. Where if I said to you, guess what? I've collected 400,000 spoons, plastic spoons. I got them in my attic, right? That's my thing, right?
Yeah,
they'd say, wow, you're a hoarder.
You need some therapy. Yeah.
Yeah. They'd say you're a hoarder. You're messed up. But if I said, guess what? I've collected $400,000.
It's a good job. Wow, good for you.
Right? You wouldn't say, what'd you have to do to
tell me how to do that? Yeah, show me how to do that.
You wouldn't say, what'd you have to do to get it? You'd say, wow, high five. That's commendable. You're a role model. You did it, right?
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And then you made me think about all these ideas about like, it was funny because like somebody had I think there was a title of a book or a seminar or something, what makes a winner? What makes someone a winner?
Yeah.
And usually that's the title of a webinar you want to attend because you can figure out, hey, I'm a winner and I'll teach you how to be a winner too, how to be successful. But here's the truth. Like I think it'd be hilarious to do something like that, like write a book or do a webinar. What makes a winner? And then when you get in, you open the book and the first line says a whole bunch of losers. In other words, for someone to be a winner, what it takes for someone to be a winner is a whole bunch of losers. What does it take for someone to be a billionaire? A whole bunch of poor people, because we can't. There's only there are limited resources, and not everybody can be a leader. Not everybody can be a winner. Not everybody can be a billionaire. We bought this idea that is possible, that it is true, that that's this American dream or whatever, success, unlimited success. But the truth is, you don't have that level of success without a whole bunch of people who aren't successful. In fact, it's like Chekov was saying, the happiness, the happy man, his happiness depends on the silence of all the unhappy people. And so that's sort of a necessary thing. That's part of the equation.
Yeah, and also like, do your plans reckon with the existence of lack?
Right.
Like, how much can I acquire myself until I should feel guilty, or raise a red flag because other people have lack for more essentials,
Yeah, it's the difference between having enough and having, like you said, this sort of psychotic level of like, what's wrong? Like, the average person who's successful, let's say, if you had $500,000, that should be enough. Good for you. You've got it. You've done it. But when you have $500,000 and you say, no, I want $1 million, and then you have $1 million, you go, no, I want 10 million. No, I want 100 million. I got my first billion. What if I get 10 billion? I want 100 billion. Now, and you know what? Now I need 1 trillion. It's like, you already, you look at someone like Jeff Bezos or these other guys, and you're like, I'm like, who needs that kind of money? He'll never live long enough to spend it. There is sort of a psychosis about it. Like, no, I need more. Why? Why do you need more? Because you really don't need it. But it's just this endless desire. I mean, again, this goes back again to, I think Girard was right about how sort of that root of evil being these desires, and these desires that are out of control and have no regard for the other, no regard for anybody else. It's just, I need to get mine, and I don't care who suffers along the way or as a result.
Yeah. Yeah, like I don't like it's funny, like I really wish I had more money than I do right now.
Sure.
Right. And I hope someday I do. But I don't look at Jeff Bezos and say, man, that guy's cool. Right. Not at all.
Right.
Right. So that's kind of funny. What's wild? After the brother sees the gooseberries, he actually is really kind of rattled by it. And the despair that is creeping in from the field, that's actually truth. It kind of shakes him up a bit, where he's like, I know something's up here, but I don't see what I can do about it.
Yeah.
And maybe the problem is that I'm not young. If I had youthful energy, maybe then I could change the world. But now I'm kind of stuck, right?
Yeah.
So he's talking about how he heard people say that science and technology and religion will save us, and if we educate the lower classes, that will help us save things and change the structural system and make everything better. But now he can't even believe in that.
Yeah.
And he says, you will fall back upon the natural order of things, the uniformity of phenomenon. But is there uniformity and order in the fact that I, a living, thinking man, stand over a chasm and wait for it to close by itself? Or to fill it up with mud at the very time when perhaps I might leap over it, or build a bridge across it? And again, for the sake of what? Wait till there's no strength to live? And meanwhile, one must live and one wants to live. So he's saying he notices this oppression, and he hears people saying, and this is something quite often in Chekov, when people start to notice something's wrong, and this was in the air in the 1890s, people would say, soon the technocrats will fix everything.
Uh-huh.
And H.G. Wells and the smart kids will get rid of inequality.
Uh-huh.
Right? So he says, they say, wait. And he's like, I'm old. Hello.
I
Right?
can't wait much longer.
Right. So he says, I went away from my brother's house early in the morning, and ever since then, it has been unbearable for me to be in town. I'm oppressed by its peace and quiet.
Uh-huh.
I'm afraid to look at the windows, for there's no spectacle more painful to me now than the sight of a happy family sitting around the table drinking tea. I am old and not fit for the struggle. I am not even capable of hatred. I can only grieve inwardly, and at night my head is hot from the rush of ideas, and I can't sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good.
And it's funny, like, this is a good note for us to end on. But again, like I said, maybe that despair wasn't despair, but it was the man with the hammer, and was truth in disguise. And also, maybe he shouldn't sleep tonight.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, this is awesome, man. I really love these conversations. This has been another 2-hour marathon one, but I think it was really good. Thank you, everyone who made it to the end. God bless
Yeah,
you.
you should get a prize.
You should get a prize at the end. Awesome. Yeah. Well, good stuff, Darrell.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for listening. We'll see you again next time.
Yeah.